Hello YouTube chess lovers, my friends, this is Gunjan here and welcome to the second part of my chess repertoire against e4. Now in this section I'm going to cover when your opponent plays d5 and grab more space on the queen side. Well, certainly here black will play knight to e7, and you can see I have highlighted by the arrows over here white has so many choices. But the good part from the black perspective is against each of them our plan of campaign is pretty much similar. Now what I have done in this video is I will show you piece layout and the theory of this line, and then we will see some of my own games which will illustrate how you can go for the win in this kind of positions. So here black has two choices, especially if you are a King's Indian player and you like a King's Indian structure. Then there is one easy way you can get a very advantageous King's Indian structure. So it runs like this. So black plays d6 followed by g6, and then bishop goes to the g7, and now black plays this amazing move which is f5. Normally in King's Indian structure black plays knight to f6 first, and then this knight goes somewhere, let's say it goes to either h5 or e8, and then black pushes the f5. So in a way it loses one tempo. But here f5 comes straight away directly, and that way black can save one tempo, and that can be very effective. The further line can run like this, so black will play knight to f6 and castling on the king side with a normal King's Indian theory. Now in this video I have not covered this system because I don't play often King's Indian. So if you want to play this system, then you better learn the theory of the King's Indian structure. The other line which I'm going to recommend here is this one. Let's say here white will play knight to c3 and then will play knight to g6. So if you calculate the moves over here, what black has done is this knight goes from b8 to the g6, so it has been shifted on the king side, and the last move of the black is just free up this bishop. And I'll show you the main theory or the idea behind this line. So what black wants to do is put the bishop on b4, and if white allows, then black wants to capture this knight and giving black a double pawn. So you can see these pawns right now are double, and we want to block the queen side of the white, and then we are concentrating on the king side attack, and that is the pretty much plan of the black. So let's see how the pieces can be placed. So first of all what we are going to do is we'll play d6 followed by the knight to f6. So you can see the knight to f6 is gaining time on the pawn, so white has to defend that pawn somehow. So most logical way is bishop to d3, and then we are going to castle on the king side. Here we have very simple idea. We want to put one of the knight on the f4, and there are two ways you can do it. The first way, if your opponent does not allow knights to h5, then you can play h6, and then after knight to h7 you can look forward for the push of f4. And the second way you can do is you can play straight away if your opponent allows this. So you can play knight to h5 and then knight slot into the very beautiful square knight to f4. And then this plan is very simple. You want to push the f pawn, so after f5, let's say white captures over here, one pair of bishop has been captured. You can see the f file has been opened up, and the queen has access of either f6, g5 or h4. So let's say here queen goes h4 and the other rook can join the party, and we have very slow but very effective attack going on the king side. And you will see in my games most of my opponents are helpless against this plan. There is one important concept that you should remember in this theory is, let's say if meantime white goes on the queen side, let's say it plays c4, then you should do not allow these pawns to go forward. So one way to do is you play b6. So now you can see this square has been blocked, and if white still insists to open up the game with the move a4, then we are going to play a5, and you can see this lovely pawn chain. So starting from e5 to goes to the a5, and it's cramping the whole queen side of the white, and that means if the queen side has been blocked, we can concentrate on the white king side, and that is very effective plan. So I hope you understand the theory, and now I'm going to show you some of my own game which will show you how you can implement this theory in the practice. Now the first move which we want to deal is the space gaining move, which is c4, and this is the most likely chances when your opponent grab more space with the move d5. Well, against this you should go with our recommended plan. So you will play knight to g6, and the idea is very simple. This bishop will go either to c5 or goes to the b4. In my first game, my opponent replied with knight to c3, and here I pin this knight, and in this game my opponent responded with knight to f3. So you can see by doing this move order, white is allowing black to capture this knight, so we should certainly capture this knight and giving white a double pawn. And now it's time to play d6, so stopping any c5 advance. Here my opponent responded with bishop to d3, and I played knight to f6, and now my opponent castle on the king side and I castle on the king side. And now here my opponent played this move, which is bishop to g5. So try to pinning the knight. It's a good time to kick this bishop, so I played h6. Please note, bishop cannot go to the h4 because it will simply capture by the knight. So in this game my opponent plays bishop to e3. His planning is very simple. He wants to push this guy to the c5. Please remember, this is very important. Whenever white wants to expand on the queen side, we should stop this. So we have to play this move, which is b6. So now that pawn has been locked, and now my opponent play this move, which is rook to d1. I don't know what's his intention, but it's just like a prophylactic move. Now here comes a very good move, which is knight to h5. Now whenever you play knight to h5, you need to keep in mind that this e pawn, your e pawn is under attack. But right now it is very safe. The reason is because white has a loose bishop on d3. Here white cannot play this move, which is knight to e5, because if we play knight to e5, it looks like gaining a pawn, but after knight cross e5, it's white which lose a piece after the whole exchange. So whenever this bishop is loose on d3, you can certainly look forward for knight to h5. So keeping in mind that trick, my opponent plays queen to d2, and now my wonderful knight has been posted on f4. And if you can manage your knight to put on f4, that means 50% of your game has been won. Here my opponent strangely preserved that bishop, so he played bishop to c2, and you know the plan. Yep, it's f5. So now we are opening up the f file. My opponent plays a4, and I played a5. And if you remember, this is the structure we were talking about in the theory. So now I have completely locked the queen side of the white. That means white cannot do anything on the queen side, and that is the area of play of white. If white cannot do anything on the queen side, white has to sit and watch the black attack and hope that black make mistake, which we are not going to do. After a5, my opponent responded with h4, which is a kind of mistake, and this kind of mistake will happen if you block him like this. And can you spot here the wonderful move? Yep, it's knight cross g2, and after king cross g2 we have move f5. That means regaining a piece with a better pawn structure. And my opponent plays rook to h1, so trying to defending that pawn because it was attacked by knight and the queen. But here I capture the bishop, and after queen captures I played bishop to g4. So again attacking the knight, and my opponent carelessly played this move, which is bishop to d1. And can you spot it? It's more or less game is over. So I simply capture the knight, and after forcefully white has to recapture with the bishop, I simply play knight cross h4. White lose a piece. So my opponent plays king to f1, but after very simple rook cross f3, queen to e2, and rook to f5, I simply emerge with a piece and a pawn up, and my opponent resign over here. So that is one game which perfectly matched to our theory, and that's why I have included as an opening game. Now in the second game of c4 line, it's very instructive because my opponent was an FM. So I played knight to g6. So idea is very simple. I want to play bishop to b4, and my opponent responded with knight to c3, and I played bishop to b4. But instead of last game, knight to f3, this time FM plays bishop to d2. So he clearly understands the positional damage which black does to the white. Here there is one small trap that black should avoid. If you carelessly play moves such as d6, then you will lose a piece with queen to e4 check. So please remember this: whenever your bishop is on b4, you never play this d6. So you will wait, you will probably castle first and then probably play d6. But when your bishop is on b4, never play d6. Here I played knight to f6, so attacking the pawn, and white defended with bishop to d3, and I played castle on the king side. And my opponent responded with a3, so I captured the knight and white recaptured with the bishop. So you can see that way white does not allow black to damage his pawn structure. Nevertheless, we continue with our main line. So I played d6 and my opponent responded with knight to e2. So the logic is very simple. White wants to push f4 before black plays f5. But here, as per our theory, it's very simple. So we are going to play knight to h5. So we are not only stopping black's f4, but black himself is preparing the move f5. Here my opponent castled on the king side and I played knight to f4. Again the wonderful square for the knight. My opponent captured the knight and I recaptured with another knight, and here he played queen to f3. Now this is one loose move, I can say, because it's provoking the f5, which I in fact did. So I played f5 and here he captured, I recaptured with the bishop, and after bishop exchanged, my opponent plays bishop to d2. So right now his idea is very simple, because this knight does not have any good discoveries, so he just want to improve his bad bishop. Nevertheless, I played queen to f6. So idea is very simple. I want to slant this queen to the g6, and then the other rook can join into the f8. And as per the theory, this will be a wonderful position for the black. Here my opponent responded with rook to c1, so probably he wants to push this guy to c5. I played queen to g6. So now I'm trying some cheapos based on the pin g2 pawn. So my opponent captured this knight, so I recapture, and then he plays queen to g3. So he wants to exchange the queen. Well, if the queen has been exchanged, then white is doing fine, but I didn't allow him. So I played, first of all, rook to g4. So his queen has been attacked, so he played queen to h3, and now I played this move, which is rook to f8, and my all three major pieces are lining to his king. Here my opponent responded with f3 and I played rook to d4. So planning is very simple. Rook want to penetrate on the second rank of the opponent enemy king, and my opponent decided to again offer me the queen trade, which I declined with this move, which is queen to d3. So now you can see the queen to d3 has a merit that it attacking the c4 pawn. My opponent defended elegantly with rook to c3. So not only defending the pawn but attacking the queen. So I played queen to d2, and again the queen exchange has been offered, which again has been declined, and I played queen to g4, and now my opponent plays rook to c1. So idea is very simple. Now white desperately want to push the pawn, but here I place rook to d2 attacking the queen, and now again my opponent offered the queen trade, and this time I accept that. So I take the queen, and when white recapture, I snap up that pawn. And here I think we both were in the time trouble because we have less than 30 seconds in our clock. Opponent plays c5, and please note last few moves are not that much accurate, but still in a time pressure I managed to win this game. So I played a very casual and a bad move, which is rook to f7, and here my opponent captured the pawn, I recapture, and now he give me this check, and after I put my rook back, he plays rook to c7. I played g6, and after he plays rook to d7, so which has an idea of putting this rook on this line or probably capturing this pawn, I decided to challenge that rook with rook to f7. Here my opponent gave me this check, and after king to g7 he grabbed the pawn. I played rook to d2, try to maintaining the pressure on the d pawn, but as I said that we both were in the time trouble, so he played this horrible move, which is rook to e6, and afterwards the game is very simple. I capture this pawn, and after this rook again attacking the pawn, I played this move, which is rook to a4. After captures and rook to e7, I simply played b6, and here my opponent lost on time. But even if he didn't lost on time, you can see black has a 2 passer on the queen side, and if one pair of rook has been exchanged, this can be a very easy game for the black. Now the third game features when white blocks the check with his own bishop. So for example, here instead of knight to c3, in one of my game my opponent plays knight to f3, and when I give this check with bishop to b4, my opponent block with bishop to d2. Well, if your opponent block this check with the bishop, then our plan of campaign will become more easier, because we are simply going to snap up that bishop. White recaptures with anything like queen or the knight. Let's say in the game my opponent captures with the knight, we can play d6 first of all, stopping any c5, and after h3 played by my opponent, so he doesn't want this knight to be pinned, we have this amazing move, which is knight to h6. And you can see instead of knight to f6, we can play this knight to h6 just because white dark square bishop has been exchanged, and now knight to h6 will provide more venom to the f5. So let's see how this game progresses. So my opponent plays bishop to d3, I castle on the king side, and he did the same, and now comes the f5. So now you can see this time 3 pieces are joining for the f5. So my opponent captured this, and I recapture with the bishop, and here he recaptured and I captured with the knight. So now this knight has arrived on a wonderful square with f5. Here my opponent plays knight to h2, so now he wants to put this knight on this g4, but nevertheless I put my another knight on the wonderful square, which is knight to f5. Look at those knights, they are wonderfully placed, and there are something nasty happening soon. Here my opponent responded with queen to g4, which is pretty immature, because here I can kick this queen with h5. My opponent plays queen to f3, I again harass this queen with knight to h4. In the game my opponent plays queen back to d1, but after very simple knight h cross g2, and my opponent responded here knight to f3, so he was stopping me, my queen, to coming to the g5 square, but I found another way, so I played queen to e8. So now I want to go to queen to g6, and again want to give some discovery to the white king. Here my opponent responded with queen to d2, I played queen to g6 anyways, and my opponent parked his king in the corner, so king to h1. But here I simply play e4, so attacking the white knight, and the knight goes to the d4, and here I simply capture the pawn. And you can see already black has a very wonderful position. Please note, black cannot play rook to g1 because knight cross f2 is coming. So in the game my opponent decided to play f3 first of all, and when I played knight to h4, attacking that pawn one more time, now my opponent decided to give me the exchange, so he played rook to g1. But here I simply place queen to h6, and I think again in this game he was in time trouble, I wasn't, and that's why I played this cunning move. At first sight it looks like black has given up the queen, and my opponent immediately captured this queen, but after knight to f2, this is a checkmate. You can see how easy and effective plan if black can able to exchange the dark square bishop with the white. Now the second move which I want to consider here is knight to f3, which has a merit of attacking the pawn, but it doesn't stop our routine plan, which is knight to g6. in this game my opponent was much higher rated. He was 2200 plus in the chess cube. He responded with bishop to c4, which is kind of a weird move, but it has a venom of pushing that pawn further. Nevertheless, I continue with the bishop to c5. So you can see in c4 line, because white has opened up the c5, that's why the bishop to b4 looks very logical. But here white has not committed the c4, so that's why this time it's very useful to put this bishop on c5. Anyways, my opponent goes for the naked attack, so my opponent plays knight to g5. It has a merit of pushing that pawn and attacking the f7, but I just blocked that pawn, so I played d6, and my opponent responded with castling on the king side. And here I played knight to f6, which has a merit of first playing h6 and then grab this pawn. So my opponent wisely played knight to c3. Anyways, I place a6. Good side is knight or the bishop can be stopped at the b5, and the main idea is this bishop, it has been attacked, then it can goes back to the a7. Here my opponent plays bishop to e3, so he wants to swap up my bishop. I place h6, and here my opponent captured the bishop, and I recapture, and my opponent plays knight to f3. Here I play bishop to g4, so I'm pinning that knight. My opponent responded with h3, and I capture that knight, and after white recapture with the queen, I simply castle on the king side. My opponent responded with a4, and I responded with knight to f4. So again, more you put the knight on f4, you will see his potential. The one way I can describe this knight to f4 is a pain in the ass to your opponent, because in this game my opponent responded with rook to d1, and I played knight to e8. So that is very simple. I want to block that d6 with my knight. So my opponent responded with rook to d2, and I played knight to d6, and that has a merit of attacking the bishop, so bishop drop backs to the a2. Now I played queen to g5. So idea is very simple. I want to capture that pawn with a check, and then I can grab that rook. So my opponent wisely plays rook to d1, protecting that rook, and I played f5. So you can see this plan of campaign hasn't been changed, and we are very much consistent to our kingside attack plan. Here my opponent captured that pawn, and after I recapture with the rook, my opponent lashed out with knight to e4, so attacking the queen. Here I played knight takes knight, and after queen recapture, I think probably he completely overlooked this attack. So here I played knight check, and after king to h2, which has a merit of attacking the knight, I simply played knight cross f2, and has a merit of attacking the queen and the rook. Here my opponent first of all plays d6, so discover attack to my king, and after I played king to h8, he played queen to c4. This is a outright mistake. Why? Here comes why. So very simple is queen to h5 check, and after kings to g1, white is simply checkmate. The third move which I want to cover is the move f4, and that has been played many times when I played knight to e7. Here the best reply is you capture that pawn, and after white recapture with this, you play knight to g6, so which has a merit of attacking the bishop. Please note the bishop cannot go to the e6, because very simple will be queen check and the e pawn will be dropped. So white reply has been pretty much forced, so white has to play bishop to g6, and now we are going to play knight to f6, so which has a merit of attacking the pawn. Now if your opponent is feeling very aggressive, then he might want to try this move, which is e5, but this is a losing mistake, because the very simple reputation is queen to e7, attacking that pawn, and let's say white defended with knight to f3, then the very simple idea is queen check, and after knight to d2, we can simply snap up the d pawn. And there are so many threats over here. First is queen can capture this pawn, also the knight to e3 is in the picture, and please note black emerged with a pawn up, so this is a very wonderful position for the black. So e5 is a bit premature. In one of my game, my opponent responded with bishop to d3, and here I played bishop to c5. This is pretty much forced. Please remember in this line, whenever white plays f4, it's a very good idea to place this bishop on c5 rather than b4, because bishop to c5, it's stopping white to castling on the king side. My opponent continues with the knight to c3, and I responded with the d6, and now he plays knight to f3, and here I castle on the king side, and now my opponent plays queen to e2. So probably my opponent is feeling aggressive, so he wants to castle on the queen side and attack me on the king side. But nevertheless, I place rook to e8, so I'm pressurizing more on the e pawn, and now here my opponent castled on the queen side, and I played bishop to b4. This is very amazing that this one move turns out very strong for me. In the game, my opponent responded with queen to d2, but after very simple knight cross e4, white lost a pawn. So here my opponent continues with bishop takes knight and rook takes knight. He plays rook to d1, but after very simple rook takes and rook takes, I played bishop to d7. He responded with a3, attacking my bishop. The bishop dropped back to the a5, and after king to b1, I played knight to e7, pressurizing the d5 pawn. And here my opponent responded with knight to g5, and he completely overlooked my this move, which is bishop takes knight, and after queen takes, I simply grabbed another pawn. And after very simple queen to d2, bishop to c6, and knight to f3, I simply play queen to d7, and after knight to d5, I place rook to e8, and I clearly emerged with a 2 pawn up, and in fact I won the game very easily. The third game, which I have played with my friend Umang Dwivedi, his rating on chess.com is around 1700, which features the move knight to c3. So here when black capture the pawn and after white recapture, knight to g6 and bishop to g3, when black responded with knight to f6, instead of our bishop last game bishop to d3, in this game Umang plays knight to c3. Here the plan of campaign is very simple. We are going to pin this knight. In this game Umang replied with queen to d4, attacking the bishop, but we simply capture this knight. And please note, queen cannot capture this bishop because the e pawn will drop, so my opponent has to forcefully capture this pawn with the b pawn. And now I played d6. Here he gave me this strange check, which is bishop to b4 check, and after bishop to d7, he played bishop to d3. So he can argue that my bishop has been misplaced, but anyways, I castle on the king side, and after knight to f3, now comes the wonderful move, which is knight to h4, so attacking the bishop. And if that has been allowed, then the white pawn structure will be very shaky. In the game Umang plays bishop to f2, I played bishop to g4, so attacking the knight, and my opponent responded with h3, and I capture the knight. And after white recapture, after all this exchange, you can see this squares have been very weakened, and I explored this very magnificently. So first of all, I played knight to e5, trying to get some cheapos with knight cross f3. So Umang plays queen to e3, and I pressurize that pawn one more time with queen to f6, and after bishop to e2, here comes our trademark move, which is knight to f4. And see those knights, they are wonderfully placed. In the game Umang castle on the queen side, so he wants to attack my king on the king side, but after very simple knight cross e2, queen cross e2, and queen cross f3, I clearly emerge with a pawn up. And please note, white has a double pawn on the queen side. So after a long struggle, I managed to win this game. That is how you can handle if your opponent plays knight to c3. Probably the most aggressive reply by the white is this move, which is h4. At first sight it looks very weird, but it has a very cunning idea. So if black wants to put the knight on g6, then white can immediately kick that knight, and if the position remains blocked for the black, then isn't the white game is very good? Well, against this there is a one theory of the chess which says if your opponent is playing on the flank, you should play in the center. This is the case of one of my game. This game I have played with my friend Om Dave. He does not have any FIDE rating, but his strength is around 17 to 1800 plus. And here I responded with f5, and he responded with knight to c3, and after knight to f6 he pinned that knight with bishop to g5. Anyways, I played knight cross e4, and after knight cross e4, f cross e4, he plays queen check. So his idea is very simple. He wants to weaken my king side, and after very natural g6 he plays queen to e2, so gaining back the pawn on e4. And when I place d6, he plays a very wonderful move which at first sight looks very threatening. He plays h5. Here I thought for a very long time, and I come out with this move, which is queen to d7. The idea is very simple. When white capture the knight and after black recapture, and when white goes for the hill, so white takes this pawn. So please note my h pawn is pinned right now, but black has a very cunning idea, which is queen to g4. So queen to g4 is attacking the queen, but the big idea is to recapture the pawn. So in the game, Om capture the queen, recapture with the bishop. He plays g cross h7. So white has a pawn on h7, but is this pawn weaker or stronger? That can be shown in the game. In the game I played king to f7, and after bishop to e2 I simply drop my bishop back to f5, and after bishop to h5 check, king to g7. Now you can see my three pieces are attacking that pawn, and if the pawn has been taken by the rook, then the bishop will be pinned. So wisely Om drop back the bishop, but after a very simple recapture I emerge with a superior position. Please note black has a bishop pair, and finally I managed to win this game. So that is one game which highlight how you should handle if your opponent plays aggressive move or the sidelines move such as h4. The last move which I want to consider is bishop to e3, and this was played by one of my friend on ChessCube. He is a very strong attacking player. Now the idea behind this weird looking move bishop to e3 is that when black responded with knight to f6, white will play f3. So that way white is right now blocking those knights. White wants to create this pawn chain, as you will see the game progress, and cram the black pieces. Now let's see how we can progress from here. So I played knight to g6 as per our routine theory, and he responded with c4. So as I mentioned, white wants to create this very amazing pawn chains, and here I responded with bishop to b4 check, and after knight to c3 I simply capture this knight, and after white recapture, here I place d6. In the game my opponent responded with b3. This is, I think, probably the best move of the white. The simple reason is if the bishop comes to the d3, then acts like a sophisticated pawn, but if b3 has been played, that means this bishop can go either to g2 or to h3. Look at this g2 and f3. They are limiting this knight to come to either this three squares. So all in all, this is a very wonderful move. After long thinking, I responded with castling on the king side, and after my opponent plays bishop to g2, I played h5. Here he responded with knight to e2, and I played h4. And probably he's afraid of opening up on the king side because he wants to castle on the king side. So he decided to block the king side with the move g5. But now comes a very good tactic. So I played h3, so attacking the bishop, and when the bishop captured the pawn, I simply captured the e pawn, so knight cross e4. So idea is very simple. When white recapture with the f pawn, I give this check, and after king goes to the d2, I regain my piece. So now I'm attacking the g4. My opponent responded with g5, and now I place queen to h4, so attacking the loose e pawn. My opponent defended with knight to g3, and now I place knight to f4, our trademark move. And now this is threatening the capturing the g pawn, so my opponent is obliged to capture this knight, and after queen recaptures, my opponent plays king to d3. But after very simple queen cross g4, You can see white king is truly caught in the center, and not only that, black emerged with a pawn up. I hope I have given enough information to make you confident that when your opponent plays d5 and grab more space, you should be happy that he is allowing you to go for the kingside attack. Just grab this opportunity and go for it.